The first time Emily heard the knock, she barely noticed it. It was faint, a soft tap that barely rose above the hum of the TV. She had been sitting on the couch, sipping her tea, eyes half closed as the evening news blurred in the background. Midnight had come and gone, and the house was quiet, save for the gentle creak of the old wooden floor beneath her. She lived alone in this house, the one her grandparents had left her, and the silence had long since become her companion. When the sound came again the next night, it was a little louder. A single knock, a little more urgent but still gentle. She paused, her hand hovering over the remote, unsure if she'd imagined it. It could have been the wind, she reasoned. Maybe something outside, a branch brushing against the door. But when she looked out the window, the night was still, the trees unmoving, and the street beyond was empty. A cold shiver ran down her spine, but she shook it off. It was probably nothing, just a creak in the old house. After all, she'd lived here long enough to know that the walls had their own sounds. Houses like these always did. But then it came again the next night, and the night after that. Always at the same time, midnight, sharp. The tap on the door had become a strange kind of ritual, as if the night itself was waiting for her to notice. She would sit in her usual spot, cup of tea in hand, watching the clock tick closer to 12. And without fail, as soon as the hands aligned, the knock would come. Each time she would pause, waiting to see if it would happen again, wondering if she should get up, go to the door, and check. For the first few nights, she didn't bother. She brushed it off as coincidence. Maybe some kids are playing a game, she told herself. Maybe they're knocking and running off. It was easy enough to believe that at first, but as the days turned into weeks, the knocks grew louder, more forceful, less like a prank and more like a demand. Emily started to anticipate it, her whole body tensing as the hour approached. She hated how it made her feel, nervous, on edge. It was as if the night was playing a cruel joke on her, and she was the only one who didn't know the punchline. One night, when the knock came, she finally decided to check. Her heart pounded in her chest as she crossed the room, the creak of the floorboards under her bare feet, unnaturally loud in the quiet house. She reached the front door, hesitated for a moment, and then pulled it open. The cold night air rushed in, biting at her skin, but there was no one there. Just the empty porch, the street lamp casting its dim glow over the deserted road. She stepped outside, peering into the darkness, straining her eyes to see if anyone was hiding in the shadows. But there was nothing. No footsteps retreating into the night, no sign of movement at all. The next morning, she stood on the porch in the daylight, inspecting every inch of the door, the steps, the yard. Maybe there were footprints. Maybe she had missed something. But everything was exactly as it had always been. No signs of life, no clues to explain the nightly disturbance. It was unsettling, but Emily convinced herself it had to be someone messing with her, a harmless prank. She even laughed about it with her coworker at the office the next day. Kids in this neighborhood have too much free time, she had joked, though deep down the unease lingered. Night after night, the knock continued. Sometimes it was soft, barely audible. Other times it was loud, like a fist hammering on the wood. But no matter how quickly she ran to the door, no one was ever there. Her nerves were frayed, her sleep restless and filled with strange dreams. She started waking up at odd hours, convinced someone was inside the house, though she always found it exactly as she had left it. Soon, the knock became something more. It wasn't just a noise, it was a presence. She could feel it, something out there just beyond her reach. Watching, waiting. The air around her seemed to grow heavier each night, thick with a tension she couldn't explain. The knock, once a nuisance, now filled her with a sense of dread she couldn't shake. The quiet of the house, which had once felt comforting, now felt suffocating. She was no longer alone in her home. The knock was changing her. It followed her even in the daylight. At work, she couldn't focus. She found herself jumping at small sounds, her mind constantly drifting back to the midnight visitor. The anticipation was unbearable, a slow, creeping anxiety that settled into her bones and refused to let go. Then, one night, the knock came, louder than ever before. It reverberated through the walls, shaking the door in its frame. Emily shot up from the couch, her heart racing. This time, she didn't hesitate. She rushed to the door, yanking it open with a force that surprised even her. But again, no one was there. Only the cold night air and the street, silent and empty. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she stood on the porch, her eyes scanning the darkness, waiting for something, anything, to move. But there was nothing. She slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. Her mind raced with possibilities. Was someone stalking her? How could they be so quick, so elusive? She wanted to call the police, but what would she even tell them? That someone was knocking on her door at midnight? They would laugh, or worse, think she was losing her mind. For the first time, Emily wondered if she was losing her mind. That night, she barely slept, her mind buzzing with fear and confusion. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the knock to come again. When it finally did, her whole body tensed, but this time she didn't move. She couldn't bring herself to open the door again. The knock, it seemed, had become a part of her life. But now she knew it was more than just a sound. Something was coming for her, something she couldn't explain, and it wouldn't stop knocking until she let it in. The knock had become an unwelcome fixture in Emily's life, a nightly ritual that left her both on edge and exhausted. No matter how many times it happened, she could never shake the cold fear that crept over her each time the clock struck midnight. The relentless sound echoed in her head even when she wasn't home, following her through her days like a shadow. But the night she first saw the figure standing beyond her porch was the moment when everything shifted. It was no longer just a knock. Now there was something more, someone watching her. It was late, and Emily had been pacing the small living room, too anxious to sit still. Her eyes kept flicking to the clock on the wall, counting down the minutes to midnight. The knock was coming. It always did. She had tried everything to stop it, ignoring it, waiting outside before midnight, even leaving the lights on all night. But it didn't matter. The knock would come, uninvited, unstoppable. Tonight, though, a strange heaviness hung in the air, an unsettling feeling that she couldn't shake. The house was unnaturally quiet, as if holding its breath along with her. Emily stood by the window, peering out into the night, her hands gripping the windowsill. The street was still. The trees in her front yard swayed gently in the breeze, casting long shadows across the lawn. Then she saw it. At first, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her. A shape, dark and indistinct, hovered just beyond the porch, standing still near the street. She blinked, her heart skipping a beat, and squinted to see better. The figure didn't move, didn't come any closer. It was just standing there, watching her house. Emily froze, her breath caught in her throat. She tried to make out the details, whether it was a person or something else. But the shadows were thick, wrapping around the figure like a cloak. All she could make out was a vague silhouette, tall and unmoving, like a statue standing at the edge of her yard. Her pulse quickened, a low thrum of panic rising in her chest. Who is that? She wanted to tear her gaze away, but she couldn't. The figure seemed to be looking directly at her, though its face was hidden in the darkness. For several agonizing moments, neither of them moved. Then came the knock. Emily's body jolted, her heart slamming against her ribs. The knock was louder than it had ever been, a sharp, angry sound that seemed to shake the whole house. It echoed through her bones, reverberating off the walls. Without thinking, she rushed to the door, hand trembling as she reached for the knob. But something stopped her. That figure was still out there, wasn't it? She glanced back at the window, half expecting the figure to be gone, like a ghost vanishing into thin air. But no, it was still there. The knock came again, louder this time, more forceful. But Emily didn't open the door. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the shadowy figure. It didn't move, didn't come any closer, but its presence filled her with a dread she couldn't explain. What if it was the one knocking? What if it was waiting for her to open the door? Emily backed away slowly, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She stumbled over a chair, the noise breaking the silence, but the figure didn't react. It just stood there, motionless, watching. The knock came a third time, deafening now, rattling the door on its hinges. She spun around, expecting the door to burst open at any second. But nothing happened. The silence stretched on, thick and oppressive, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Slowly, hesitantly, Emily crept back to the window. The figure was still there, standing in the exact same spot. Fear clawed at her insides as she stared at it, her mind racing with possibilities. Was this some kind of sick game? Was someone toying with her, waiting for her to break? Before she could stop herself, Emily grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her fingers shaking so badly she could barely press the numbers. 911, what's your emergency? The calm voice on the other end was a lifeline, pulling her back from the brink of panic. "There's someone outside my house," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She kept her eyes glued to the figure, half expecting it to start moving toward her. "I don't know who it is, but they've been standing there for a while, just watching." "Are they armed?" the dispatcher asked, their voice steady and professional. I don't know," Emily stammered, her mouth dry. "They're just standing there." "We'll send a unit to your location," the dispatcher said. "Stay inside, keep the doors locked. Is there anyone else in the house with you?" "Number, I'm alone." "Help is on the way, stay on the line with me." Emily's heart pounded as she backed away from the window, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She glanced at the clock. It was 12:05 a.m. The knocking had stopped, but the silence felt even more suffocating than the sound. She couldn't help but glance back out the window, but when she did, her stomach dropped. The figure was gone. Her breath caught in her throat, panic rising like bile. She scanned the yard, the street, the shadows, but there was nothing, no sign of anyone. It was as if the figure had melted into the darkness, leaving no trace behind. I don't see them anymore," Emily whispered into the phone, her voice trembling. "They're gone." "Stay inside," the dispatcher urged. "The police are on their way." Emily hung up, her body shaking as she locked every door and window in the house, her mind spinning with fear and confusion. Who had been standing there? Why had they been watching her? And more importantly, why had they left so suddenly? The police arrived 15 minutes later, but by then, the street was empty. They searched the yard, the surrounding area, even knocking on her neighbors' doors, but no one had seen anything. No footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. "Probably just some kids messing around," one of the officers said, but his words did little to comfort her. Something about the figure had been wrong. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't a joke. Whoever, or whatever that figure had been, it wasn't playing games. The officers left, offering her reassurances that they would patrol the neighborhood for the next few nights, but Emily knew it wouldn't help. The figure had disappeared too easily, too quietly, as if it had never really been there at all. But as she closed the door behind the officers, something caught her eye. A series of strange, jagged marks had been scratched into the wood of her front door, symbols she didn't recognize. They hadn't been there earlier. Her stomach twisted in fear as she traced them with her fingers. What did they mean? Why hadn't the police noticed them? Emily stepped back from the door, her mind racing. Whoever had been out there wasn't done with her. They had left her a message, something she couldn't yet understand. But whatever it was, she knew this was only the beginning. By the time the whispers began, Emily's sense of reality had already started to unravel. The nightly knocks had become a fixture, a torturous countdown to midnight that filled her with dread she could no longer ignore. The appearance of the figure and the strange symbols etched into her door had taken things to a new level. This wasn't just about fear anymore. Now it felt like something was actively trying to communicate with her, to reach her. But what came next, what followed the knocks and the figure, was far worse. It was as if whatever had been lurking just outside her home had finally found a way inside. The first whisper came one night when Emily was lying in bed, clutching her blanket tightly around her shoulders. It had been a long day at work, one that left her mentally exhausted and aching for rest, but rest was becoming increasingly difficult. She was hyper-aware of every sound in the house, the groaning of the floorboards, the creak of the old pipes, the soft ticking of the clock beside her bed. She had started staying up later and later, dreading the inevitable knock, her anxiety making sleep a distant dream. That's when she heard it, her name spoken softly, barely a breath on the air. Emily. Her eyes snapped open, her heart pounding. She lay completely still, every muscle tense, ears straining to hear it again. Maybe she had imagined it. Maybe it was part of a dream, a strange auditory hallucination conjured up by her tired mind. But then she heard it again. Emily. This time it was unmistakable. A whisper, so quiet it could have been the wind slipping through a crack in the window. But it wasn't. It was deliberate, and it knew her name. Emily shot up in bed, her skin crawling with fear. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the voice, but everything looked the same. The room was still, bathed in shadows. The window was closed. The door to her bedroom was shut. Nothing seemed out of place, and yet she knew she wasn't alone. The whisper came again. Emily. Her heart raced, and she jumped out of bed, backing into the far corner of the room. She pressed herself against the wall, trying to make sense of it. The voice was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once, filling the room with an oppressive weight. It felt like the walls themselves were breathing, closing in on her. "Who's there?" she whispered into the darkness, her voice trembling. There was no answer, just silence. And then the knock came, louder and more forceful than ever before, rattling the door as though someone was on the other side, desperate to be let in. She clutched her chest, feeling the panic rise like a wave, threatening to pull her under. When she finally gathered the courage to check the door, she found nothing as usual. No one was there. The porch was empty, the street quiet, but the whispers had left their mark. From that night forward, they came every time the knock did. It wasn't just a knock on the door anymore. It was someone or something trying to speak to her. The whispers grew bolder. They started talking to her in the dead of night, just as she was drifting off to sleep. Sometimes they called her name. Other times they said things no one else could know. They spoke of memories she hadn't thought about in years, secrets she had buried deep inside herself. They told her about her childhood home, the summer her father died, the time she'd stayed up all night reading under the covers as a little girl. They knew everything. At first, she tried to ignore them. She covered her ears, played music, did anything to drown out the sound, but it didn't help. The whispers seemed to penetrate everything, seeping into her mind, turning her thoughts against her. The more she resisted, the louder they became. Then the notes began to appear. The first one was on the kitchen counter, just a scrap of paper with a single word scrawled across it in shaky handwriting. Prepare. Emily's stomach lurched when she saw it. She had locked the house, every window and door. No one could have gotten in. And yet the note was there, waiting for her when she came downstairs in the morning. She held it in her trembling hands, reading the word over and over, her mind racing with questions. Prepare? Prepare for what? The second note appeared on her bedside table the next night, as if placed there deliberately while she slept. This one was more specific. "It's coming." She stared at the words, her heart pounding in her chest. Who was doing this? Was it the same person or thing that was knocking every night? Was it the figure she had seen in the yard? She tried to tell herself it was just a cruel joke, some elaborate prank. But deep down, she knew better. The notes weren't a joke. They were a warning. From that night on, the notes became more frequent, each one more unsettling than the last. They showed up in places they had no business being, tucked under her pillow, inside the locked bathroom, even in the glove compartment of her car. Always with the same chilling message: prepare. Each time she found one, Emily's sense of reality crumbled a little more. She no longer felt safe in her own home. Every shadow became a threat, every creak of the floorboards a reminder that something was watching her, waiting for the right moment to make its move. She tried telling Rebecca about the notes, about the whispers, but even her best friend looked at her with thinly veiled skepticism. "Emily, are you sure you're not just stressed? You've been working so much lately, it could be getting to you." "I'm not imagining this," Emily snapped, more harshly than she intended. "I'm not crazy, Rebecca. I didn't put these notes here, and I'm not hearing things." "I didn't say you were crazy," Rebecca said, her voice softening. "But maybe you should talk to someone, get some help, just in case." But Emily wasn't listening anymore. What was the point? No one else could hear the whispers. No one else had seen the figure. To everyone else, it was just her overactive imagination, her mind playing tricks on her. That night, the knock came again. Louder, more forceful than ever before. The whispers, too, had grown louder, hissing her name, telling her things, pushing her toward the inevitable. Emily pressed her hands over her ears, squeezing her eyes shut, praying for silence, for some kind of escape. But the voices persisted, weaving their way into her thoughts, unraveling her sanity. "It's time," they said. "You have to prepare." When she finally pulled her hands away, something new awaited her. A single piece of paper lying on her pillow, written in that same frantic, jagged handwriting. This time, the note didn't say prepare. It said tonight. Emily sat in the darkness, the clock ticking relentlessly toward midnight. The room felt cold, colder than it ever had before, the air heavy with something she couldn't name. The whispers had been quiet tonight, too quiet, as if they were waiting for her to understand what had been creeping at the edge of her consciousness all along. The knock was coming. It always did. But tonight was different. Tonight everything would change. The note on her pillow had been simple, yet it echoed in her mind, louder than any of the others. Tonight. It had been hours since she'd found it, but the weight of that word pressed on her chest like an invisible hand, squeezing tighter with each passing minute. Tonight. The warnings had led her to this moment. The whispers, the knocks, the strange symbols, they had all been pointing to this final reckoning. The clock struck 12. Her breath caught, and for a moment, the silence was unbearable. Then, as if on cue, the knock came, sharp and demanding. It reverberated through the walls, filling the empty spaces of the house with its insistent pulse. Emily's body went rigid, her heart hammering in her chest. But she didn't move. She had spent too many nights answering the door only to find nothing. Not tonight. Tonight, she needed answers. The knock came again, louder this time, and then again, each one a little more desperate, as though whoever, or whatever, was on the other side had grown impatient. The air in the room thickened, pressing down on her, suffocating her with the weight of expectation. But she wasn't afraid anymore. Not really. Not after what she had seen. Emily's gaze shifted to the laptop on the table, its screen frozen on the footage she had watched earlier that evening, over and over again, unable to tear her eyes away. The camera she had set up outside her front door had finally given her the truth she had been searching for. But it wasn't the truth she had expected. It was worse, so much worse. In the footage, at precisely midnight, she had watched herself rise from the bed. Her own sleeping form, eyes closed, face expressionless, like a puppet being guided by invisible strings. She had walked down the stairs, her movements slow and deliberate, as though in a trance. Then she had stood at the front door, her hand lifting to knock. Once, twice, 3 times. She was the one knocking. The figure she had feared, the visitor that had tormented her for weeks, wasn't a stranger. It had never been a stranger. It was her. Something inside her, something she couldn't control, was trying to get out. The revelation had hit her like a sledgehammer, knocking the breath from her lungs. All this time, she had been looking for an external force, something outside of herself. But the truth had been inside her all along, hiding in the recesses of her mind, waiting to reveal itself. A third knock, louder now, broke the silence, echoing through the house like a death knell. Emily felt a shiver run through her, but she stayed where she was, sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling in her lap. She didn't need to check the door. She knew no one would be there. She was already here. The whispers returned, curling through the air like smoke, soft and insistent. Emily. They hissed her name, but now she understood. They weren't speaking to her, they were speaking for her. They had always been a part of her, buried deep beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to be heard. It's time. The knock came again, more urgent now, as if begging her to answer, to face what she had been avoiding for so long. But the answer was already clear. She had seen it on the footage. She had seen the truth with her own eyes. Her body had betrayed her. With trembling hands, Emily reached for the laptop, her fingers brushing against the keys. She played the footage again, watching herself knock on the door in her sleep. Her movements were mechanical, like something else was controlling her, pulling her strings. And yet, there was something in the way she stood, something familiar. It wasn't just her body acting out some strange ritual, it was her soul, fractured and trapped inside her own mind, trying to escape. The realization hit her like a wave, cold and unforgiving. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just in her mind. It was her, a part of her she could no longer suppress, no longer hide from. The knock came again, but this time it wasn't just a sound. It was inside her, rattling her bones, echoing in her skull. Her heart raced and she pressed her hands to her chest, trying to keep it together, but it was too late. The knocking wasn't coming from outside the house anymore. It was coming from within her. It's time. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they weren't just whispers anymore. They were voices, overlapping and chaotic, screaming her name. Emily clutched her head, squeezing her eyes shut, trying to block them out. But they were everywhere, filling the room, filling her mind. And then, with a clarity she had never felt before, Emily understood. The knocking, the whispers, the symbols. They had all been signs, warnings. She had been preparing for this moment, whether she knew it or not. The thing inside her wanted out. Her hands trembled as she rose from the bed, her body moving on its own. She felt disconnected from herself, like she was watching from a distance as her legs carried her toward the door. She tried to stop, to turn around, but she couldn't. Her body wasn't hers anymore. The knocking was relentless now, each one louder than the last, shaking the walls, vibrating through the floor beneath her feet. Emily reached for the door, her fingers brushing against the cold metal of the lock. And in that moment, she knew. She knew that once she opened it, there would be no turning back. The thing inside her would finally be free. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The whispers surged around her, urging her on, pushing her toward the inevitable. Her hand hovered over the lock, shaking with fear and anticipation. Open it. And then, with a single decisive movement, Emily unlocked the door. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, she stood there, her hands still on the doorknob, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The air around her felt thick, charged with energy, as though the whole house was holding its breath. Then, slowly, she pulled the door open. The darkness beyond was complete, an abyss that seemed to stretch on forever. And in that darkness, she saw herself, her reflection, standing in the doorway, eyes wide and empty. It was her, but not her. It was the thing that had been knocking all this time, the thing that had been waiting to be let out. Emily stared into the eyes of her reflection, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to scream, to run, but she was frozen in place. The thing smiled, a slow, terrible smile, and in that moment Emily understood. It had already won. The last thing she heard before the darkness swallowed her whole was the sound of the door closing behind her.